7:30 a.m. and we are on the go.
By 8 a.m., we have an Omni travel card.
And are on the one train to South Ferry Station.
Our translation: no smoking, no smelly armpits, no boomboxes.
13 stops, 19 minutes travel time later, we are at South Ferry.
The only way out with the scooter is through this gate. Sign reads, unauthorized use prohibited. I did not see the tiny wheelchair sign. Open it. Alarm bells sound. We exit. Nothing happens.
First visit, Staten Island Ferry to go to Staten Island. Noisy hooting as we leave.
The wooden pier supports probably need frequent replacement.
Looking up the Hudson River. We got a 9:30 a.m. ferry and I had no problem getting a position for my mobility scooter.
It's Memorial Weekend and there are many military overflights.
The Statue of Liberty. We need to grab a starboard position for this view.
We felt that visiting Liberty Island would not give us the same photo opportunities. All images would have to be taken looking up, distorting them.
Bayonne Golf Club. What a setup. Approaching Staten Island.
From Staten Island, we get the next ferry back to South Ferry.
Liberty of the Seas in the Cape Liberty cruise port.
Viewing the Statue of Liberty is from the other side of the ferry. Hence, there is no one visible on the port railings in this image.
Passing Governor's Island. 6 days in New York is not enough time to see things. Our trip is over. We enjoyed it, probably because it was free. Near South Ferry Terminal is a monument to the men and women of the United States Coast Guard who served their country in World War II. Into the depths of the Wall Street area. So many different styles of architecture.
The Wall Street Stock Exchange, USA flag flying for Memorial Day.
Tiny St. Patrick's Church among the soaring skyscrapers. The magnificent main stained glass window.
Leaving the church shortly before noon, we saw that entry to the church had been stopped. Lucky timing for us. A quiet fire engine? What?
As the view flies in towards the Freedom Tower, the Oculus is straight ahead.
Immediately before it and to the right is the 911 Memorial. The north and south pools stand on the spots where the Twin Towers once stood.
They are surrounded by trees. One of these trees is the survival tree, the only tree in the area to have survived the attacks. The tree was discovered by rescue workers in October 2001. It was badly damaged with broken roots and branches. After careful restoration of the tree, it was returned to the memorial in 2010. Today, the tree stands as a living reminder of resilience, survival, and rebirth. Visitors may leave messages on the tree railings.
Trees mean squirrels. Their antics help lift the mood, as the sadness that lurks here is especially tangible. The tall buildings around the memorial pools, it is humbling to know that you are standing where once tall buildings proudly touched the clouds. To me, the two pools signify the renewal of life through the water which continually recycles. It cascades down into the pit, the bottom of which cannot be seen. I reconcile this with symbolizing forever the blackness of death that is thrust upon us by those who wish us harm.
The South Pool has had to be emptied for repairs. Every birthday, a white rose is placed on the name of that missing person.
We silently watch the family making their own personal remembrance. Looking back, we've just come diagonally across the street from the 9/11 Memorial to view the Fire Department of New York Memorial Wall.
On 9/11, 343 firefighters lost their lives. This memorial is on the wall of Fire Station Ladder 10.
The Oculus at the World Trade Center.
The white building is representative of a bird.
There is a small opening in the roof, an oculus, through which the sun shines in at 10:28 precisely on 11th September, the exact time when the second tower collapsed.
Near the oculus is one of the Wildlife Wonders sculptures, a massive octopus with its tentacles supporting various endangered animals. It is called the Arms of Friendship.
This is the Wild Table of Love, an artwork that invites anyone to a symbolic banquet in bronze where the table is set for both humans and animals. Gail is hoping for a seat.
St. Paul's Chapel, less than 100 yards from the destroyed skyscrapers, by a miracle survived the destruction of September 11, 2001. Volunteers took on duties to help the firefighters, rescue crews and police to rest and wash up. The church became a center of a community of hope. The vestment of unity. Patches from all units at Ground Zero were pinned onto the priest's chasuble and worn by volunteer clergy during the months following 9/11.
Working shifts at Ground Zero were grueling, and responders found respite in the 235-year-old chapel. The chapel's pews were places for prayer, meditation, and rest. Over time, the heavy boots and equipment scuffed and scratched the pews, transforming them into lasting symbols of remembrance.
This church has seen so much of which should not have occurred.
Following George Washington's inauguration, he attended services at St. Paul's.
The church also has a painting of the New York seal, adopted in 1777. It has the official state motto, Excelsior, ever upward.
The church houses a 1785 painting of the Great Seal of the United States, one of the earliest known depictions. Looking back at the memorial area and the Oculus from Brookfield Place.
Before we pass through the building,
Seeking a bus stop to catch the free downtown connection bus.
to take us closer to the Brooklyn Bridge. An early stone-built building contrasts with the modern steel and glass neighbor.
The seal of the city of New York, seen on the side of a building near the Brooklyn Bridge. The date, 1625, is the establishment of New Amsterdam, now New York City, by the Dutch. The seal's design includes a windmill sails, a beaver, flour barrels, a sailor, and a Native American, all encircled by a laurel wreath.
We still have quite a long walk to get to the walkway. So near and yet so far.
In that time, Manhattan's municipal building comes into view. Next to the municipal building is the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse. The Woolworth building is also visible from the Manhattan side of the bridge.
At the start of the bridge, just 1.1 miles to the other end. The tarred path gives way to planking and I bump my way across. Planks, cobbled, crazy paving, they all shape my scooter. Considering it is a Saturday, traffic flow seems quite moderate. .1 miles in 33 minutes. We give it to you in 33 seconds. I have crossed the bridge and become Mrs. Bond, shaken, not stirred.
Battery change time on the scooter, looking up at the Brooklyn Bridge from the area on the Brooklyn side known as Dumbo. Proof that cops anywhere only put their emergency lights on after a pickup of fellow cops to head out for a coffee.
Manhattan Bridge and 1 Manhattan Square, a residential block. Back near the Brooklyn Bridge, we see families relaxing on the lawns.
Walking near the bridge pylon, we can see Jane's carousel in the glass building. The Freedom Tower, newly constructed next to the 9/11 Memorial, dominates the skyline.
Photographers all around. Is this a bride or someone on a photo shoot?
I don't have a drone to capture this kind of shot, so I settle for my version of the Manhattan Bridge.
A sweep from 1 Manhattan Square, following the Manhattan Bridge.
The strong tidal flow in the East River can be seen as this yacht is turned through 180 degrees.
The Williamsburg Bridge is visible beyond the Manhattan Bridge. River cruiser Manhattan II sails serenely down the East River.
Helicopters are everywhere and have been all day. We're not planning to walk back across the bridge, and this ferry reminds us we can take a high-speed ferry to Wall Street.
The river taxi powers us across the river to the Wall Street dock. We get to see Manhattan from water level.
A final look back at Brooklyn. As our ferry vessel continues on its route.
We are quickly at South Ferry Station and on a train home.
Traffic jam in our hotel street. It's close to midnight. Last look down on Times Square.
"11 and a half hours for our trip today. Good night. See you all tomorrow."